Let's talk about joints. No, not the joints the hippies smoked back in the 60s. Joints as in arthroses or articulations. It's where two bones come together. It allows you to do things like this. Joints can be classified in two ways. Joints can be classified by structure and by function. Does that sound familiar? Does that remind you of something we've talked about before? It should. Structure and function is anatomy versus physiology, okay? So the structure of a joint. Joints have three types of structures. They can be fibrous, which means they're made of fibrous connective tissue, or they can be cartilaginous, which means they're made of what? Cartilage. Where was Mickey Mouse when the lights went out? In the dark. See, these are simple questions. Don't overthink them. So joints can be fibrous, cartilaginous, or a very special kind of joint called a synovial joint. These are the most common joints in the human body. They're the joints in most of your appendages, arms and legs. Most of your joints are synovial joints. Then by function. So joints can be classified according to their range of motion, how much they move. So the least movable kind of joint is a Syn Arthrosis. A Syn Arthrosis is an immovable joint. And you're going, wait, what? An immovable joint? I thought joints move. Well, no. Here's a case where this is a joint that does not move. Joints are where two bones come together. It's possible for two bones come together and not allow movement. That's a Syn Arthrosis, immovable. Then there are joints that are partly movable. Those joints are called an Amphiarthrosis. Just like those people who went to Amphi High, they're partly movable. I don't know what that means. Syn Arthrosis, Amphiarthrosis. Then there are joints that are freely movable. A Diarthrosis. So the deal here is that for any particular joint in the human body, we can classify it both by its structure and its function. So maybe it could be a fibrous Amphiarthrosis, or a cartilaginous Syn Arthrosis, or a cartilaginous Amphiarthrosis, and so on. Is every possible combination allowed? No. Some are not, some are. We'll take a look right now and see which ones actually exist. And that's the ones that you have to know. Let's take our first example here, a suture. So a suture is a fibrous Syn Arthrosis. Oh, this little tiny whiteboard is working hard. So a suture is a fibrous Syn Arthrosis. So what is a suture made of? What color is an orange? Orange. Sutures are made of fibrous connective tissue. How movable is a suture? It doesn't move, all right? So if I were to ask you on a quiz or an exam, give me the structural classification of a suture, you would say it's fibrous. If I were to ask, what is the functional classification of a suture, you would say it's a Syn Arthrosis. I could ask it in the other direction. I could say, give me an example of a fibrous Syn Arthrosis, and you would say suture, all right? See how easy this is? Now a suture can change. So in other words, you have sutures. Remember when you were born, you had the sutures, the fontanelles were open, and then the bones slowly grew together. Initially, when sutures grew together, they were still fibrous. Over time, a suture can ossify, and when a suture ossifies, it's known as a synostosis. Synostosis. So a synostosis is a suture that has ossified, it's turned to bone. The fibrous connective tissue is now actually bone tissue. All right? See how easy these are? So that's our first example. A suture is a fibrous Syn Arthrosis. Let's look at another one. a syndesmosis. You're going like, what the hell? What's up with these weird words? It's not my fault. There's nothing I can do about it. These were named before I was born. You just have to get used to them. So, what is a syndesmosis? Well, it's fibrous connective tissue again. But in this case, it's an amphiarthrosis. An amphiarthrosis. So, what is a syndesmosis made of? It's made of fibrous connective tissue. How movable is it? It's partly movable. It's a fibrous amphiarthrosis. Amphiarthrosis, partly movable. So, sutures, by the way, we already know those. We saw the 4 cranial sutures. Cranial sutures have class, coronal, lambdoid, remember, squamous. What was the other one? Do you remember? What was the other suture? Sagittal. Okay, so there were 4 sutures. A syndesmosis, example of a syndesmosis is the interosseous membrane. So in between your radius and your ulna, you have an interosseous membrane. It's fibrous connective tissue and it's partly movable. Why does it need to be partly movable? Watch this. Watch what I can do. This is amazing. I can hold my arm out like this without even moving my upper arm. Watch. Whoa! Yeah, did you see that? Need me to do it again in slow motion? Here you go, watch. Whoa! What's happening when I do that is my radius is spinning around my ulna. And it's the interosseous membrane, the syndesmosis, the fibrous amphiarthrosis, that allows that to happen. Now it's interesting, I had a guy in my class a few years back, and he had a radio-ulnar synostosis. His radius and ulna, instead of having an interosseous membrane, a syndesmosis, they were fused together. He had a radio-ulnar synostosis, completely bone. So he could not pronate and supinate his forearm. You know, we can reach out with our palm supine like this, and we want to pick up something here, we just flip it over and grab it. He couldn't do that. If he wanted to grab something, he had to move his shoulder to do it, and then move back like this. So he said it didn't really, you know, it's the way he was born, so it didn't seem unusual to him at all. He just got used to it early on in life, okay? Now then, what else is there? Let's talk about yet another joint, a gomphosis. A gomphosis is another example of a fibrous Syn Arthrosis. So a gomphosis, once again, is fibrous. It's made of fibrous connective tissue. And it's a Syn Arthrosis. Where is a gomphosis? Gomphosis is the joint that holds your teeth into the alveolar socket. So you don't want your teeth to wiggle around, do you? That's why it's a Syn Arthrosis. You don't want to be chewing food and have your teeth wiggling around. So it's fibrous connective tissue. You have the periodontal ligament, which holds the tooth in. That's why you can get periodontal disease, all right? That's when the bacteria, you don't brush your teeth and floss, they start to eat away that periodontal ligament. So the fibrous Syn Arthrosis is the connective tissue, the fibrous connective tissue that holds the tooth in place. Okay? See how easy these are? So once again, on a quiz or an exam, I would say, what is the functional classification of a gomphosis? What would you say? You should have said Syn Arthrosis. Okay? See, these aren't hard. Or likewise, if I said, give me an example of a fibrous Syn Arthrosis, you could say either suture or gomphosis. Either one would be correct. All right, let's continue with some more joints. Let's continue with a synchondrosis. A synchondrosis. So I've talked about this before. Whenever you see chondro, what does that mean? It means cartilage. So what is the structural classification of a synchondrosis? A synchondrosis is a cartilaginous joint, cartilaginous we just made it. So it's a cartilaginous joint, and it's immovable, so it is a cartilaginous Syn Arthrosis. Where do we find a Condor? Well, the epiphyseal plate is an example. Remember, in the epiphysis of a long bone, there's that cartilaginous band. So it's cartilage, and it doesn't move, all right? I mean, you lay down bone tissue on one side and you lay down cartilage on the other, but the joint itself doesn't go anywhere. So it's immovable. That's a cartilaginous Syn Arthrosis, okay? And one more kind of joint here. We have a symphysis. So a symphysis is a cartilaginous joint again. Oh my gosh, I lost the consistency of my color coding. Better make that black. A cartilaginous, and this is partly movable. So it's an amphiarthrosis. A cartilaginous amphiarthrosis rather. So what's it made of? It's made of cartilage. How movable is it? It's partly movable. Remember the pubic symphysis? That was the little connection of cartilage in between the two pubic bones. Yeah, and why was it partly movable? Because that little parasite has to get out through that opening. All right, you need it to give a little bit. Also, just when you're doing things like you're running, you know, your hips are twisting, you want there to be a little bit of give so you don't break your hip. All right? So notice these are the basic kinds of joints here, examples of joints. For each one, we can classify it according to its structure and according to its function. So again, I'll ask it in any way. I'll say, give me the functional classification of a gomphosis, give me the structural classification of a suture, tell me what kind of joint is a cartilaginous amphiarthrosis. I'll ask it in any direction. And you should know it, okay? Now notice the two that we didn't talk about are synovial joints and diarthroses. Every synovial joint is a diarthrosis. Every synovial joint is freely movable. So your elbow joints, your interphalangeal joints, your metacarpophalangeal joints, and here you have your glenohumeral joint. All of the synovial joints in your body are freely movable. These are kind of like the odd joints, the ones you may not have heard of before. But now we're taking an anatomy and physiology class, so it's time to hear about them, okay? So text and email me with any questions.